It began with a burst of shouting, a sharp cry cutting through the calm rhythm of a quiet suburban Saturday. The birds hushed at once. A lawnmower down the block coughed and died. Curtains twitched as neighbors peeked out cautiously. Something was brewing. At the center of it all stood Helen Armstrong, the self-proclaimed ruler of the Homeowners Association. She carried her clipboard like a royal staff, eyes scanning lawns for flaws with merciless precision. To most, she was simply the HOA Karen, and on that morning her rage was focused on one man, Daniel Rivera, the reserved neighbor whose devotion to gardening had turned his modest backyard into a dazzling display of blooms. Roses, lavender, climbing ivy, even a tidy vegetable patch. Daniel's garden looked like a scene from a glossy magazine. To most it was delightful. To Helen it was a crime. This is a violation. Helen's voice rang down the cul-de-sac. She stabbed her finger at Daniel's trellis, heavy with roses. Do you think bylaws are optional? This is not farmland, it's a neighborhood. Daniel stood at his gate.com/soil, still clinging to his gloves, unshaken by the outburst. Helen had nitpicked before, but this time was different. Her face was flushed, her whole body trembling. Your garden, she raged, is dragging down property values. It's messy, unruly, and selfish. A handful of neighbors drifted onto their porches, curious but silent. They secretly loved Daniel's flowers, the only yard alive with color. But no one dared challenge Helen in full fury. Daniel finally spoke, steady and respectful. Helen, with all due respect, my garden breaks no written HOA rule. I've checked twice. A heavy silence followed. Helen's mouth drew into a thin line. Her eyes darkened, storm brewing. Then, with a dramatic flourish, she lifted her clipboard. We'll let the board decide. I'm calling an emergency meeting tonight. Shock rippled through the street. An emergency meeting over flowers. Yet Helen meant it. Daniel glanced at his roses swaying peacefully in the breeze, unaware they had just sparked the strangest battle the neighborhood had ever seen. This was not about plants. This was about power, pride, and a drama only beginning to unravel. By evening, the clubhouse was jammed. Folding chairs scraped across the floor as residents crowded in, eager for the scene Helen had staged. Normally, HOA meetings dragged on with talk of trash bins or fence colors. Tonight was different. Tonight, it was theater. Helen stood at the front like a judge about to sentence a man. Her clipboard lay on the table beside a perfectly organized stack of papers, highlighted and tabbed with precision. Daniel sat quietly at the back, hands folded, eyes lowered as neighbors whispered around him. Ladies and gentlemen, Helen began smoothly, her tone sharp and cutting. We are here to discuss a violation that threatens the standards of our community. She let the silence hang before declaring, Mr. Rivera's garden. The crowd stirred. Some scoffed in disbelief. Others leaned forward, hooked by the tension. Helen clicked her pen and gestured toward photographs pinned to a board. They revealed Daniel's backyard in sharp detail. Roses draped over the fence. Vines stretched across trellises. Even his modest corner of tomatoes stood proud. This, Helen announced, tapping the photo with her pen, is disorder. It is excess. It is, to be blunt, an eyesore. Daniel lifted his head. An eyesore. His tone was steady, though a trace of pain flickered in his eyes. Many of you have told me you like passing by my garden. Some of you have even taken clippings. I never believed it would upset anyone. Murmurs swept the room again. Mrs. Patel from across the street spoke gently. Helen, I think his garden is beautiful. It's the only spot my grandchildren love when they visit. Helen's face flushed. With all respect, Mrs. Patel, this isn't about preference. It's about regulations. If one person ignores them, what comes next? Chickens roaming, goats grazing, a wild jungle swallowing our roads. A few laughed under their breath, though none too boldly. Helen's fierceness was both frightening and oddly captivating. Daniel rose. Tell me the rule I've broken, he said. Firmly, show me the exact wording in the HOA guidelines that bans flowers or vegetables. Helen froze. She shuffled through her clipboard, pages crackling. The rule says all landscaping must be tidy and orderly. Daniel lifted his hands. Is this not tidy? Is this not tended? Every plant trimmed, watered, alive. My garden is no neglect. It is devotion. Silence spread. For the first time, uncertainty stirred among Helen's staunchest followers. And Helen, feeling her hold slip, clenched her jaw. This wasn't a meeting anymore. It was a struggle for dominance. By the following morning, the divide was obvious. Half the neighbors seemed to side with Daniel, praising his garden as a place of beauty and calm. The rest, fueled by Helen's tireless campaign, grumbled about standards and slippery slopes. Helen herself was unstoppable. Clipboard in hand, she strode from door to door, collecting signatures for what she proudly called a garden ordinance. Her plan was to push a fresh rule through the HOA, one that would restrict the types of plants residents could keep. No vines, no vegetables, no bold displays, she recited like a refrain. Meanwhile, Daniel continued his days with quiet grace. He watered the roses, trimmed the lavender, and greeted neighbors kindly. Yet behind the calm exterior, he felt the pressure of the storm building. Each sideways look, every hushed exchange on the sidewalks reminders that his refuge had turned into contested ground. By midweek, tensions reached their peak. Helen marched to Daniel's yard, 2 neighbors, shadowing her as witnesses. She planted herself firmly at the gate, arms folded. "Daniel," she said, her voice sharp as a blade. "The trellis must come down immediately. It violates height limits for yard structures." Daniel put aside his watering can. "Helen, that trellis has been here for 3 years. You've seen it countless times." "It's different now," she snapped. "Now it props up overgrowth. It's ugly, and I won't allow it." Neighbors drifted closer, drawn to the standoff like moths to flame. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Daniel locked eyes with Helen. "You can't keep shifting the rules. Just because you dislike something, this isn't about the trellis, it's about power." Helen's face reddened. She thrust a finger toward the roses curling up the trellis. "That garden is a threat, it doesn't belong." Then, in near theatrical fashion, she lifted her clipboard high as if to strike the gate. Gasps rang out from the watchers. Helen caught herself, lowering it with a stiff laugh, but the harm was done. People were no longer only doubting her authority, they questioned her judgment. Mrs. Patel stepped forward, her voice shaky but strong. "Helen, enough. This is harassment. Daniel's garden harms no one. It brightens this street. You're the only one blind to that." The crowd murmured in support. For the first time, Helen's grip seemed to weaken. Yet Helen Armstrong was never one to retreat. Her eyes narrowed, and she muttered, "If that's the case, I'll escalate." The neighborhood realized then the conflict was far from finished. By the weekend, talk buzzed like bees in a hive. Rumors spread faster than Helen could knock on doors. Some claimed she planned to fine Daniel into surrender. Others whispered she had contacted county officials about zoning breaches. Nobody knew exactly how far she'd go, but all agreed she wasn't finished. On Saturday afternoon, the tension snapped. Daniel was in his garden trimming lavender when footsteps crunched across gravel. He looked up to see Helen advancing, clipboard under her arm like a shield. 3 HOA board members followed, clearly dragged into her display. "This is the final warning," Helen declared, loud enough for both sides of the street to hear. "If this so-called garden isn't dismantled by Monday, the board will issue maximum daily fines." Daniel set aside his shears. His hands were steady, his voice edged with steel. "You can't fine me for something not against the rules, and you know it," Helen smirked. "We can change the rules." A collective gasp rose from the small crowd gathering again. Neighbors leaned on fences, perched on porches, waiting as though for a stage play. "Change the rules?" Daniel asked. "So you'll rewrite history because you don't like roses? Because I don't tolerate disorder?" Helen snapped. She gestured toward the board members. "Do you want this wilderness spreading house to house, cucumbers on mailboxes? Where does it end?" The board shifted uneasily, unprepared for such a spectacle. They hadn't expected such a scene. One of them, Mr. Green, cleared his throat. "Helen, maybe we should," but Helen cut him short. "No, this is about protecting order." She stepped closer to Daniel's gate, her face only inches away. "I will not let one man ruin this neighborhood with his weeds." Daniel's patience finally broke. His voice rose, not in anger, but in firm conviction. "These are not weeds. This garden is life. It brings joy. You want control, Helen, but you can't command beauty. And you will not destroy it." His words lingered in the air, carried by a sudden breeze that rustled the roses behind him. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, to everyone's shock, Helen reached forward and snapped a rose clean from its stem. Petals scattered to the ground like red confetti. Gasps erupted. Even her loyal backers recoiled. For the first time, Helen appeared less a leader and more a tyrant. Daniel's jaw tightened as he stared at the broken flower in her hand. Something shifted. The neighbors felt it, and Helen herself seemed unsettled. The conflict had reached its breaking point. News of the snapped rose spread like fire. By nightfall, nearly every house buzzed with outrage. It was no longer just about Daniel. It had become about fairness, about whether one voice could control them all. On Monday evening, the HOA board called a special meeting. The turnout was unlike anything before. Chairs ran out. People crowded shoulder to shoulder, a low hum of anticipation filling the room. At the front sat the weary board, and beside them Helen, stone-faced, clutching her clipboard. Daniel entered last, carrying a surprise vase filled with roses, lavender, and rosemary from his garden. He placed it softly on the board's table. The fragrance spread, gentle yet unshakable. "This," Daniel began, his tone steady, "is what we're here to discuss. Not rules, not power, beauty, community. Life. My garden has never broken a butt. Its only crime is growth." The room stilled, captivated. Daniel turned to Helen. "You call this chaos, but look around. Do you see chaos, or do you see something worth keeping?" Murmurs of agreement rippled. Mrs. Patel stood. "My grandchildren adore that garden. It's the heart of this street." Another neighbor added, "It's where I go when I've had a hard day." Daniel's garden gives this blocked character. Voices rose one after another until the room pulsed with support. The board exchanged looks. Mr. Green, the eldest, lifted a hand. The bylaws have been reviewed, he said carefully. There is no violation, no penalties. The garden stays. Cheers erupted, applause filling the hall. Relief washed over Daniel, though he stayed composed, offering only a respectful nod. Helen, however, leapt up. This is unfair. You're letting feelings outweigh order. But the mood had shifted. Even her allies avoided her eyes. For the first time, Helen stood alone, her words drowned beneath the wave of approval for Daniel. She gathered her clipboard, lips tight, and stormed out. The slam of the door echoed like the final act of a play. That night, beneath glowing porch lights, neighbors gathered in Daniel's yard. They shared laughter, stories, and even cuttings from his garden, vowing to plant their own. The roses swayed gently in the night air, as if triumphant. In the end, it wasn't about a garden. It was about resisting control, about choosing community over fear. And in that quiet cul-de-sac among Daniel's blooms, something stronger than rules had taken root, something called unity. Enjoying this wild HOA drama? Hit subscribe for more unbelievable neighborhood stories. And don't forget to like and comment. What would you do if a neighbor went full Karen over a garden?